the phenomenon of long and wide sleeves in the socio-political context of 14th century Mamlūk Egypt.
Thank you, Christine. First of all, I want to thank, of course, Kindinger, Rosita, Bas, Professor Romani, who is unfortunately not here right now, and Alexandra for having me here today, and for giving me the opportunity to present my preliminary research to you. Well, dress is a signifier of identity, and in the Fitting In and Standing Out project, in which I work as a PhD, we study dress in order to reconstruct both minority and majority groups in Egypt, respectively Christians and Muslims. And we do that in order to understand why and how people aim at fitting in or standing out as part of their identity formation process. Well, this presentation today will be about the wide-sleeved kameez. And Shirley Guthrie, researcher and author of the book Arab Women in the Middle Ages, Private Lives and Public Roles, defines the kameez as a simple sewn sleeve shift of varying length with no front opening and merely a round neck hole. Well, in 14th century Mamlūk Egypt, the wide-sleeved kameez was a marker of high status, and it was worn by Christians and Muslims, as well as men and women. From the Mamlūk historian al-Maqrisi, we know that the wide-sleeved kameez, which was worn by the women, was called the bidʿa. Well, previous research has made it clear that developments around the kameez were a topic of political debates on different governmental levels at various moments in time. However, the role of this sartorial trend on identity formation from the perspectives of gender, religion, and other forms of social stratification still remains unclear. Also, patterns of the phenomenon across space and time are still understudied, as previous research was centered on Egypt only. Well, this presentation today is based on 19 references that I found in the primary sources. And out of those primary sources, I tried to distill, sartorial boundaries that played a role in identity formation in 14th century Mamlūk Egypt. So let's start with presenting the data to you. Well, as you can see, my 19 references are in chronological order, and you will also notice that the translations are very simplified, and this is because otherwise it would have become too complicated and too long. However, we start with an observation which was done prior to 1331 by the Maliki scholar Ibn al-Hajj, and he observed the wide-sleeved kameez, and he says, well, knowledge and wisdom are associated with the tailoring of people's clothes and the length and width of the sleeves. And some of the learned scholars are wearing the robe of honor, the khilā'a, and enlarged its sleeves. We have to keep his observations in mind. And now we come to the rest of the references, and they are mainly based on historiographies. So let's start with the history about the wide-sleeved kameez. Well, we start in the year 1336 with an edict that says that Christians and Jews are ordered to narrow down their wide sleeves because they were too long. Only 10 years later, al-Maqrisi states that the women of the Sultan, as well as his slave girls, used to wear the wide-sleeved kameez, and women, and common women, or in Cairo streets, started to imitate them. And this led to discussions between the Sultan, the ministers, and his judges, and was followed by an edict that the wide-sleeved kameez was forbidden. And the wide sleeves were even burned. Also, the matching shoes were forbidden. In 1350, there was again an edict in Egypt and in Damascus, and the edict said that women were not allowed to wear the sleeves that touch the ground. And I can really tell you they must have been really long. I have an example later. So what happened was that women that disobeyed, they were drowned. So that's what the source said. I don't know if we can believe it or not. So in 1361, the wearing of the white sleeves was again forbidden and the sleeves got cut off. 1374, women had to decrease the size of their sleeves. 1381, we find it's one of the first sources that mention that women used Venetian cloth, albunduki, to sew their white sleeves. And women really increased the size of their sleeves until they resembled the women of the Mamlūks and other significant women. And we also know that those white sleeves were between 3 and 3.5 forearms in length and were made of Venetian cloth. In 1319, again, women continued wearing the sleeves. The sleeves again were forbidden and were cut off. In 1391, again, the wearing of the white sleeves was forbidden. And then I have two more sources that are from the beginning of the 15th century, but they are still worth to be mentioned. In 1417, it was forbidden for Christians to wear the white sleeves because they resembled jurists. And in 1419, Christians again were not allowed to wear the white sleeves. From these primary sources, I was able to distill three types of sartorial boundaries. The first type of sartorial boundaries are gender boundaries, because women were not allowed to wear the white sleeves. They were cut off. And for those first type of boundaries, we have 12 references that talk about gender boundaries of the 19th. And then the second type are religious boundaries, because apparently Christians and Jews, that is to say non-Muslims, were not allowed to wear the white sleeves as well. And we have three references amongst the 19 sources that allude to this. The third type are status boundaries, because the white sleeves were heavily associated with the women of the Sultan, the Mamlūks, other significant women, as well as the intellectual elite, such as jurists. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why were women and non-Muslim minorities being dressed down? Well, we have 19 references. Out of those 19 references, 12 talk about gender boundaries, 3 talk about religious boundaries, and 5 talk about status boundaries. So apparently discussions in 14th century Mamlūk Egypt about the wide-sleeved kameez were discussed on the basis of gender boundaries. So did modesty, as Chris talked about, did modesty play a role in this? Did scholars vent their anger against women because the wide sleeves were considered not to be modest enough? Were women not dressing in accordance to the sunnah of the Prophet? Well, amongst the 12 sources or references, we have only one source, that of Ibn al-Sayrafi, who says those women were definitely not dressing in accordance to the sunnah. And he vents his anger against a lack of modesty, because he says the sleeves must have been so wide, when they tucked them up, you could see the inside, what they were wearing underneath, and maybe even their naked body. So then we have to ask the question, were women one of the biggest threats to male hierarchy and identity? Well, I don't have the answer yet, and I hope that we have a good discussion after this presentation and I get some ideas from the audience. Well, so if women and non-Muslims were not allowed to wear the wide-sleeved kameez, who then was entitled to wear the wide-sleeved kameez? So we know that the driving factor behind group identity formation is fitting in and standing out, because both come with privileges. And if we apply these principles to our 14th century Mamlūk case study, we see the following. Well, we see that Muslim women, Christians and Jews, they dressed up with wearing the wide-sleeved kameez. And they did that in order to gain status by fitting in with the class of noble women or the intellectual elite, like jurists. However, we also saw that they were dressed down again, violently. And they were dressed down because the wearing of the white sleeves touched upon gendered, religious, and status boundaries. But who then stood out? Well, it was mainly a privilege of male Muslim intellectuals, jurists in particular, women of the Sultan, Mamluks, and other significant women who still were allowed to wear the wide-sleeved kameez. But there is another question we have to ask. Why did the male elite, jurists, choose the wide-sleeved kameez and, in general, white sleeves as their marker of identity, as their outfit? Well, and we come back to the Maliki scholar Ibn al-Hajj, because he says there might be an elegance factor to the white sleeves and the wide-sleeved kameez. Ibn al-Hajj says some of the common people play a game which they call the class of the judges. When they play it, they wear the attire of judges, like a big turban, wide and long sleeves, as well as a long hood, the tailasan. Then they make their attire swing while moving. The game they devote to the judges, and by doing this, make them feel at unease. I think Ibn al-Hajj's statement is very clear, because apparently the swinging of clothes and the movement was considered to be aesthetic, was considered to be elegant by the elite. Well, the famous philosopher Alan Watts, who was famous between the 1950s and the 1970s, he provides even more insights to this topic of aesthetics. He says, we tailor cloth to fit the shapes of our bodies, whereas if we let it hang loosely and follow its own flow, it confers upon us both comfort and dignity. For this elegance or grace of going along in accordance with the flow of things, and showed its difference from sloppiness by pointing out how it combined relaxation and lack of hurry with alert presence of mind and aesthetic intelligence. Well, through my own experimental work, because I had some time to sew, and on the basis of the primary sources that provided me with the length and width of those white sleeves, I tried to sew such a white sleeve. And yes, I think it looks quite elegant, looks quite aesthetic.
Want to see you.
That's my white sleeve. Looks quite aesthetic and elegant. It touches the floor. However, I also realized that physical labor is definitely not possible. So when you wear white sleeves, you can definitely not do a lot of physical labor. That doesn't work. So if you wear those sleeves, you make your living by using your brain, by being a jurist, by maybe being a wife of the Sultan. So you definitely don't work physically. However, I also tried to find some depictions of women wearing the white sleeves, but it was pretty hard to find, especially I did not find depictions of women in the 14th century, but I found one depiction of a woman wearing, looks like an outer garment with very wide sleeves from the Maqamat al-Hariri, And I also found another depiction found in the Kalila Wadimna, where a woman is also wearing an outer garment probably with wider sleeves. I will now rush through everything. Well, the wide sleeves, a synchronous transcultural trend. Well, the wide sleeves were a trend in Egypt and Europe in the 14th century. Secondary sources from the 80s state that the trend of the wide-sleeved kameez started in the Middle East, but was taken to Europe by the Crusaders. In Europe, people made them of Venetian cloth, linen. Later, Egyptians also started making the wide-sleeved kameez, also of Venetian cloth. An interesting find is that around the same time in Egypt and in Italy, sumptuary laws revolving around women wearing the wide sleeves were enforced. In both countries, in the year 1349, it was forbidden to wear the wide sleeves. In 1319, it was also a year in which women again were not allowed to wear the wide sleeves. So the countries are more or less in sync. I cannot explain this at the moment. I cannot explain this yet, but apparently both regions had the same problems and were heavily influenced by each other. And this is my last slide, which again shows the woman of the Maqamat al-Hariri wearing the wide sleeves. And on the right side is a 14th century woman in Italy also wearing it's called a sciarpa, with wide sleeves. So if there was a connection, I don't know, but when I was looking for the sources, and especially the Venetian cloth, I realized that sumptuary discussions were on both sides. Thank you very much.